Right. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to yet another Zoom talk. It's been an amazingly successful year where we've had to learn very much, and thank you all for coping with the very different arrangements that we've had to deal with. First, I'll just mention our next two meetings. On the 18th of November, we have Dick Windling and Marianne Collins talking about a new publication of ours, our latest one, which has only just been published, on the streets and characters of West Hampstead and Cricklewood, which is available for £9.95. West End Books at the moment will have had copies today, and it's available on our website, for which there's an extra charge of postage of £3. And it's the first of two books on the area. The second one will come out next year and will cover the area, which will cover Kilburn and South Hampstead. Dick gave us a very good talk earlier on this year about spies in the area, which was not on Camden, but the person had lived in Camden. On the 16th of December, we have a talk called On the Beat in Hatton Garden by Chris Foster. Chris Foster was an ex-Metropolitan policeman, and he was our first experiment with Zoom. And on a cold night in December, he took us on a walk round the area of King's Cross south of Euston Road, where as a beat bobby, he used to be out walking, and it was a mixture of crime and amusing incidents. And I look forward very much to his one round Hatton Garden, which has changed so much in the time in which he went round there. I mean, I first went round Hatton Garden in 1960s. And my first experience of walking down there was seeing people standing in a street, holding diamonds up to the light so that they could see the natural light on their diamonds. It's not a sight I've seen down there for perhaps 40 years. They're usually in vaults where, if they're not being robbed, are safe and secure there. Our newsletter, the November newsletter, will be out early in December. And as the editor of the newsletter, if there's any copy or illustrations that anyone has, I would welcome any copy this time by the 5th of December, so that I can get it ready with the Christmas delays that occur with printing and everything. And so to tonight's talk, I don't know whether our President Caroline
Yes, she is.
She is.
I think I can see her, but she's not labelled bus.
Oh, right.
Is that right? Unmute, Caroline. You need to unmute, Caroline. She's called Fiona Peregrine. There she is.
Yes, because I'm at Fiona's house.
Yes.
I thought that Ruth and Malcolm had said that I was not going to be chairing this, but I'm very happy to chair it.
Well, just introduce the speaker would be so welcome, because it's someone you know.
Yes. Well, Liz Valentine and I have been colleagues for many, many years. We're both retired now, but we both began our academic lives in Bedford College. Liz was in the Department of Psychology, and I was in the Department of History. And Liz and I have kept in touch over Bedford Society meetings. Liz was a very distinguished career as a psychologist, particularly of a historian of the early days of psychology, and particularly, of course, women psychologists or psychiatrists. And so that's what she's going to talk to us about tonight. So Liz, welcome to the Camden History Society, and thank you for agreeing to talk to us this evening.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Can everybody hear me and see the screen?
Yes.
I think so. So I'm going to talk about Jessie Murray, who was the founder and moving spirit behind the Medico-Psychological Clinic, which was the first public clinic in Britain to offer psychoanalytic therapy and training, albeit somewhat unorthodox by later standards. The clinic existed in London from 1913 to 1923, opening at Murray's house in Ensley Street. This is a picture from local studies. Murray's house is the one with the balcony, and here's a picture that I took of it more recently. It then later moved to Brunswick Square, to these houses that I think is probably where the School of Pharmacy now is. But despite her importance, Murray, who was a medical doctor and a suffragist, is not very well known. Even less is known about her close friend and collaborator, the shadowy figure Julia Turner. But archival sources at the British Library, the Wellcome Library, the Museum of London and the Women's Library have enabled some flesh to be put on the bare bones. So I'm going to try and give a portrait of Murray. So first, I'll give some biographical details about Murray and Turner and suggest ways in which they might have met. Of relevance to this is Murray's role in the suffragist movement, which provided her with contacts that were crucial in setting up the clinic. I'll also talk about how Murray got involved with Mary Stopes and came to write the preface to her famous book, Married Love. Then returning to the clinic, we'll talk about what happened to it. Why did it only survive 10 years? Murray's premature death was one factor, but there were others too. And then I'll conclude with some observations about the implications of Murray's and Turner's personalities and the subsequent development of psychoanalysis in Britain. And I should perhaps say at this point that I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychotherapist, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but there are probably people here who will be much better able to speak about these things with expertise. So, to Murray and Turner. Jessie Murray was born in northern India in 1867, and it took me about 6 months to discover that. Because she was born abroad, she wasn't in our records. But somebody at some point gave me a lead to contact the Asia Pacific and Africa collections of the British Library, and I discovered that they actually hold her baptismal certificate, which gives her date and place of birth. At the time, her father was serving as a lieutenant in the Royal Artillery, which is why they were abroad. But when Jessie was about 13, the family, that is her mother and Jessie's two younger sisters, moved back to the UK and were living in Edinburgh in 1881. 10 years later, they'd moved south and were boarding at 38 York Street in Marylebone. At the end of 1898, Murray, by then 31, met Julia Turner, who was 4 years her senior. They formed a close attachment, typical of the intimate friendships that for so many pioneering women relieved the pressure of professional careers. Such relationships were common among professional women at the time, who frequently remained unmarried, sometimes for purely pragmatic reasons, such as economic independence or lack of availability of men. Murray's and Turner's relationship was almost certainly what Martha Vicinus has termed an intimate friendship, that is, an emotional, erotically charged relationship between two women, and showed many of the signs of a life partnership that Sharon Marcus has described, often referred to as a marriage, which replaced marriage to men and was marked not only by a private sexual bond, but also by cohabitation, shared property, social networks, household labor and holidays, physical and spiritual caretaking, the use of pet names, and arrangements to be interred together. We've got evidence of several of those, and in particular, the last one we'll come back to later. Julia Turner. Now, I don't know whether this is the right Miss Turner. It might well be Julia's sister Bertha, who was also a suffragist. But she's a Miss Turner and she's a suffragist of the right period, so we'll have to accept her. It's really difficult to find pictures of women of this period, as you can imagine. I mean, if you're called Murray and you're unmarried, it's virtually impossible to trace you. Julia was the middle child of 7. Her father and 2 brothers were solicitors, which again is relevant to something later in the story. Julia studied at University College London, graduating with a BA honours degree in classics in 1889. She was clearly very proud of this achievement, as well as she might be. Women had only been admitted to degrees 11 years previously, and I'm proud to say that the University of London was the first university so to do. Turner always styled herself as Miss J. Turner, BA Hons or BA Lond. They were really felt that these qualifications were important. Now, Murray and Turner may well have met in suffrage circles, possibly through Julia's sister Bertha, who was an active supporter of the suffragist movement and a member of the Women's Social and Political Union. Or they might possibly have met through medical circles because Julia's sister Rosa was a doctor. And maybe Rosa even persuaded Murray to pursue a career in medicine. I don't know. But in any event, Murray, having received private tuition from Turner, passed the preliminary examination of the College of Preceptors in December 1899 and entered the London School of Medicine for Women in Hunter Street in 1900. Now, by this time, she was nearly 33 years old, so definitely a mature student. She took the medical examinations of the University of Durham. I'm told probably because these were considered easier than those of London, and maybe she was in a hurry to get qualified, given her relatively old age. So she qualified as licentiate in medicine and surgery of the Society of Apothecaries in 1908 at the age of 41, and passed her final medical examinations at Durham the following year in 1909. Now, her bachelor's degree had included studies in psychological medicine. After graduating, Murray attended lectures by the psychotherapist Pierre Janet at the Collège de France in Paris. She also had 3 periods of study in experimental psychology at the University College London, on the last occasion being registered for a DSc, which is the equivalent of today's PhD, though it seems she never actually completed that. But she was in fact awarded an MD by the University of Durham in 1919. Her thesis, entitled Nervous Functional Diseases from the Point of View of Modern Clinical Psychology, discussed the value of psychological discoveries in the treatment and prevention of nervous and mental diseases. Murray established a large private practice at her home at 14 Ensley Street, of which she'd been the householder since 1905. We're told that from her earliest days of practice, she was quick to perceive the psychological element in many cases of illness, and her native insight into this fact enhanced the value of her advice as a physician. She was also a consulting physician at something called the Quinton Polyclinic for treatment by isotonized seawater. This treatment had been introduced to the medical profession by the French physiologist and biologist René Camden at the beginning of the 20th century. And it was based on the idea of there being a similar saline composition of seawater and blood plasma. And Camden developed a method of filtering and diluting seawater prior to injecting it in the patient, where it was used to treat a variety of diseases and ailments. The London clinic, established in 1911, was modelled on the one in Paris. The treatment was very popular, apparently, in France and Switzerland until superseded by the development of antibiotics. The polyclinic was later renamed the Seawater Dispensary and, interestingly, moved to 225 Euston Road, which I think is where the UCLH now is. So, suffragism. Many women doctors, including such pioneers as Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, Sophia Jex-Blake, and Mary Charlieve, were of a feminist persuasion and supported the suffrage movement from its earliest days. One of these was Agnes Saville, the first woman graduate of St Andrews in 1895, and later a member of staff of the medico-psychological clinic. She was one who spoke out against the forcible feeding of suffragist prisoners and co-authored a study that helped to change medical opinion on this issue. But militant action was risky and required particular courage in view of women's precarious position and the need to retain their reputation among medical colleagues. Their greatest fear was of appearing unprofessional. Murray was a member of the Women's Freedom League, founded in 1907 as a breakaway movement from the Women's Social and Political Union, in protest at the latter's undemocratic leadership. Both were militant organizations, but the League was non-violent. It opposed the union's campaign of arson and the destruction of private property. Instead, the League directed its efforts against the government by refusing to pay taxes. Its motto was no taxation without representation, or to complete census returns, to the disadvantage of later historians, of course. A Dr. J. Murray and a Miss J. Turner donated 1 shilling to the League in 1911. Murray collected evidence and co-authored a report with the journalist and socialist author Henry Noel Brailsford on the maltreatment of women's deputations by the police on so-called Black Friday, which was November the 18th, 1910. In what was intended as a peaceful demonstration march by suffragettes from Caxton Hall to the Houses of Parliament, women clashed with the police, whom they accused of excessive violence, torture, and indecent assault. In fact, the report makes distinctly unpleasant reading. Having been considered by the Conciliation Committee for Women's Suffrage, of which Brailsford was chairman, it was forwarded to the Home Office in support of the demand of a public inquiry, subsequently refused by Winston Churchill, the then Home Secretary. Intriguingly, two of the statements of evidence are from a Miss J.T. The first is among notes of verbal statements made to Dr. Jessie Murray, which Turner, as Murray's close friend, would certainly have been in a position to give. It reads, "Thumped, flung back into crowd, gripped by the throat by PC, while held by two other PCs by the shoulders. Arm wrenched deliberately by a man in plain clothes who let go when she called out, 'This man will break my arm.' Banner pole wrenched from her hands, hat flung off." The other one reads, "On the 18th, the police behaved abominably. One hit me with his fist in the chest with great force. On the 22nd, one policeman deliberately tried to get me away by bending my thumb back. I've been in a deputation before and have come in contact with the police in a number of ways during the last 2 years, and can safely say I've never been treated with such wanton cruelty before." As professional women, female doctors had a particular interest in tax reform. Murray was a member also of the Women's Tax Resistance League, which was an offshoot of the Freedom League. In fact, she hosted a drawing room meeting for it at her home in May 1910, a rather formal affair for which printed cards were made. The following year, she had property seized for failure to pay taxes. The Daily Chronicle, under the heading "No Vote, No Tax, Lady Doctor's Sideboard and Chairs Sold," reported, "Yesterday, a curious scene took place in Tooth's auction rooms in Oxford Street. The place was thronged with ladies, most of whom wore suffrage badges, to the great astonishment of the dealers and other frequenters of the place. A sideboard and 12 chairs, the property of Dr. Jessie Murray of Ensley Gardens," paper's got it wrong again, "were announced for sale, having been seized by the bailiffs on Dr. Murray's refusal to pay inhabited house duty, which I presume is the equivalent of the community charge. The duty amounted to £4, 10 shillings and 9pence, and Dr. Murray wrote across the paper, 'I, a member of the Tax Resistance League, hereby declare that I have conscientious objections to paying King's taxes so long as women are denied the suffrage. I maintain that taxation without representation is unconstitutional.' Few dealers were present and the bidding was languid, as Dr. Murray had refused to allow the goods to be bought in on her behalf by suffragist friends, which was what happened. Finally, the sideboard was disposed of for £2, 12 shillings, and the 12 chairs for £2. Mrs. Pankhurst was among those present. Murray donated 10 shillings and 6pence to the League's funds in 1913, money which, as I've said, was often used to buy back the property of tax resistors. As many of you will know, Jenny Geddes has demonstrated the political motivation underlying the military hospital in Endell Street, founded and run by the militant suffragists Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson during the First World War, and staffed entirely by women. This remarkably successful enterprise demonstrated that women were capable of fulfilling their obligations as citizens and doing a professional job as well as men, indeed often better than men. It's thus possible that the suffragist agenda influenced the founding of the medico-psychological clinic, although it wasn't, of course, staffed entirely by women. However, I think it's more probable that the major motivation was philanthropic, a desire to make the new psychological treatments available to those with limited financial means. Whatever the case, the suffrage movement certainly afforded Murray with several crucial contacts, one of whom was the psychological novelist May Sinclair, who supported the clinic both financially and administratively. So let's get to the clinic. In July 1913, Murray convened a preliminary meeting at 32 Gordon Square, which I think is probably where the Institute of Archaeology now is, unless it's moved again, to discuss the opening of the clinic, which was chaired by Stanley Bligh, a barrister, and attended by many doctors. Henry Munro informed the meeting that the objects of the clinic were threefold: to provide a place where treatment by psychotherapy might be carried out, to bring this method of treatment within the reach of the poorer classes, and to provide inquirers with opportunities for study and investigation. Charles Spearman, who's professor of psychology at University College, stressed the benefits to be gained by psychological science from setting up the clinic, offered the facilities of his laboratory for careful observation and exact tests, and leapt to the clinic's defense when it came under attack. Murray opened the clinic at her home, 14 Ensley Street, in October 1913, the same month in which Ernest Jones founded the London Psychoanalytic Society, of whom more anon. An inaugural meeting was held at University College on November the 5th, chaired by Lord Sandwich. Patients were to include people suffering from depression, insomnia, loss of sensation, addiction, morbid attention to bodily ailments, and many other manifestations of ill health for which no adequate provision existed at that time. Phobias, delusions, and what would now be called obsessive-compulsive disorders were listed as cases of nervous and mental disorders to be treated at the clinic, the causes of which were considered to be emotional shock or mental conflict, often unconscious. It was proposed to use all forms of psychic, i.e. psychological treatment, including persuasion, re-education, psychoanalysis, and hypnosis. It was stressed that the clinic was intended as supplementary and complementary rather than in opposition to orthodox medicine. 6 departments were outlined in the original prospectus: psychological, concerned with diagnosis and assessment; educational, responsible for lectures on mental hygiene; medical, to screen out and or treat organic disorders; psychotherapeutic, physical exercise, and rather alarmingly, electrical. However, the entry in the 1918 medical directory lists, in addition, staff with the following areas of expertise: surgery, gynecology, pathology, throat and ear surgery, dermatology, radiography, bacteriology, pathology, and dental surgery. So whatever your problem, it seemed that the clinic would be able to put you in touch with somebody who could help. There was to be a nominal charge of £0.50. If you've forgotten what £0.50 was, it was an eighth of a pound. So it doesn't make much sense to say it's 12.5p, but it's what it would be. But as it was hoped that a large proportion of the patients would belong to the very poor, the smallest offerings were received. The result of this policy, of course, was that the clinic became hugely popular, but ran into serious debt. In July 1915, Murray and her colleagues launched the Associated Society for the Study of Orthopsychics, perhaps I can call it the SSO for short, which offered a 3-year training course in psychoanalysis, notwithstanding the fact that neither Murray nor Turner had undergone any psychoanalytic training or therapy themselves. This included personal analysis conducted initially by Murray, lectures on biology, philosophy, anthropology, general and experimental psychology, and comparative religion, a written thesis, and supervised work with patients. Though among the many well-known analysts trained there were James Glover and some of these people. Some of you may recognize some of these names. Though the clinic had been intended primarily for voluntary and mostly female outpatients, patients could not admit themselves voluntarily to an asylum at that time. The acquisition of further property, it moved to 30 Brunswick Square in 1914 and subsequently acquired numbers 33 and 34, which enabled the opening of a residential unit where occupational therapy was provided and to which shell-shocked soldiers were admitted in 1917. And somebody drew my attention to this rather wonderful appeal in the Times. Will you help to cure war shock in discharged and disabled soldiers? Do you know that there are tens of thousands of such men in our midst who are today nervous wrecks because they fought and suffered for you? They can be cured, but the sum of £25,000 is needed. The clinic and its staff will do their part. Will you do yours? Subscribe now. So where does Mary Stopes come into the picture? It's perhaps not surprising that Mary had little time for writing in her short life. Apart from the report on the treatment of women's deputations, her only other publication, as far as I can make out, was the preface to Mary Stopes' book, Married Love. How did this come about? It's possible that Murray's and Stopes' paths could have crossed either in Edinburgh or at University College, because they were both there at the same time, or perhaps through a common interest in seawater. Stopes is reported to have been interested in seawater, and one wonders whether she might have had some dealings with the Quinton Polyclinic. But it's most likely and definitely certain that they will have met through suffrage circles. Both women were members of the Women's Freedom League, and Stopes was a vice president of the Women's Tax Resistance League. A crucial meeting appears to have been at the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Both Stopes and Murray presented papers to the meeting in Manchester in September 15. And I've got a few pictures of Stopes here. Stopes's was on the Aptian flora of Britain, early angiosperms and their contemporaries. And Caroline might be interested to know it was Bill Challoner who told me, who had actually met Stopes, that she'd become established as one of the leading paleobotanists by the time she was 30. And Murray's paper was on therapeutic re-education. It seems highly likely that Stopes, who had had an interest in psychology since her first term as an undergraduate at UCL, attended Murray's paper, because the next day, Murray wrote to Stopes as follows. Dear Dr. Stopes, we were very glad to find how interested you are in some of the problems and work that the Medico-Psychological Clinic is engaged on. All the more so as we were greatly disappointed when you refused to lecture for us. Although we hardly like, after your second very definite refusal, to open the subject again, I'm inclined to do so on my own initiative, encouraged thereto by your evident interest in the very problems we are attempting to meet. She goes on to give more details of the courses put on by the Orthopsychic Society, urging Stopes to contact those responsible for organising the programme. Now, the next bit I think is very interesting. The following March, Murray convened a select meeting of women doctors at which Stopes read a paper. Now, the text of this paper is actually preserved amongst her papers at the British Library. And given that I was told that she deposited about 20 tons of papers with them, I would never have found this one without the help of Dr. William Frame. It was on cyclic variations in sexual desire in normal women, and put forward her hypothesis that there were two peaks, premenstrual and mid-cycle. It includes the charts, which were later to appear in Married Love. On the cover sheet is penciled, written in 1916, this was never completed, but was used as the basis of a lecture to some women doctors arranged by Dr. Jessie Murray. Married Love grew out of this MCSBL. And here are the two charts. So here are the charts. So this is the first one. So the menstrual flow is the shaded bit, and the sexual desire is the graph that's plotted. Quite erotic stuff, actually. It's amazing what you can read in the British Library. And then there's this rather wonderful one that shows the effect of fatigue, where it's all depressed, until she goes to Switzerland, I suppose, for a holiday, and you get this great burst of activity at the end, which apparently alpine air restored vitality to the subject. Stopes clearly wanted someone in authority to endorse her first and controversial book. She approached several people, all of whom refused. Chalmers Mitchell, who was secretary of the Zoological Society, the Bishop of Birmingham, with whom she'd had some flirtation, and Dean Ing of St. Paul's, was considered the most advanced of the church's thinkers. Murray would have appealed to Stopes as she was medically qualified, although she did not at that time have a doctorate, whereas Stopes was not. Her doctorate was in paleobotany. Murray tried to persuade Stopes to ask Isilda Meakin Herford to do it, who had been an early convert to psychoanalysis. Murray thought that she'd be more appropriate because she was a mother, she was married and she was actually a mother. Whether Stopes asked Herford to write the preface is not known. In the event, it was in fact written by Murray in haste in December 1917, and the book published after difficulties in finding a publisher in 1918. May Sinclair, in her enthusiasm, even credits Murray with part authorship of the book. Writing to Stopes shortly after it was published, she says, "Dear Dr. Stopes, I've ordered your and Dr. Murray's book. I did it at once a fortnight or 3 weeks ago, and I'm looking forward immensely to reading it." The last extant letter from Murray to Stopes is rather poignant in retrospect. It reads, Dear Dr. Stopes, I've only just got back to work today, having been to Durham to take my MD thesis. I've been thinking often of you and cannot help longing to know how things go. All my best wishes to all three of you, the three underlined in pencil. Yours very sincerely, J.M. Murray. It clearly refers to the child that Stopes was by this time at last expecting, but by the time the letter was written had been stillborn. Even more tragic was the fact that by this time, Murray must have known she was terminally ill. Shortly after completing her PhD, she had to retire from active work at the clinic. She made her will on July 17th, 1919, bequeathing the residue of her estate to Julia Turner, adding a codicil in September 1920, making Turner sole executrix. Murray died 3 weeks later, on September the 25th, at the age of 53, of ovarian cancer, not at her home in Ensley Street, but at the Manor House, Twickenham, which was the Turners' family home. Her death was certified by Julia's sister Rosa, who, as you remember, was a doctor. Murray's ashes were interred in her mother's grave in Highgate Cemetery. A memorial service was held in St. Peter's Church, Regent Square, on October the 7th, according to an announcement in the Times, but I haven't managed to find any account of it in the local papers. Murray was described in obituaries in the Lancet and the British Medical Journal as a brilliant and many-sided personality. Her housemate for the last 2 years, Margaret Scoresby Jackson, a medical student at the time, wrote an obituary in the London School of Medicine for Women magazine, in which she says, a medical colleague writes, her work, in my eyes and in the eyes of many other workers, will stand out as a superb and far-reaching accomplishment. I refer to her quick perception of the new world of investigation and endeavor, opened up by the infant science of psychoanalysis. At a time when only a mere handful of people were practicing it throughout the world, she actualized a scheme to bring it within reach of the student and the sufferer of small means. In doing so, Dr. Murray has earned herself a unique place in the history of mental science and mental therapy. She was the first to do, and to do practically alone, what will be done all over the world within the next 10 years. Scoresby Jackson continues, those of us who had the privilege of knowing Dr. Murray and of working with her cannot speak too highly of her rare and beautiful character. She was one who lived for the truth and for the reality of things. She faced life with clear insight and unfaltering courage, undaunted by difficulties, and with a cheerful, happy sympathy and understanding, which made her beloved alike by comrades and patients. According to Laura Price, who was a student at the clinic at the time, everyone at the clinic felt that the heart of the clinic had stopped. So who filled the gap? Well, James Glover. Now, I couldn't get a picture of James Glover without paying the British Psychoanalytic Society for it, so I didn't. A young doctor who'd become interested in psychoanalysis and joined the clinic, initially undergoing analysis with Turner, had been appointed co-director of the clinic with her and honorary secretary of the society, the SSO, in early 1918. Following the cessation of hostilities and days before Murray's death, he took the opportunity to attend the 6th International Psychoanalytic Congress in The Hague and to learn about psychoanalysis firsthand. Here he met Carl Abraham, who persuaded him to go for further analysis with him in Berlin. When Glover returned in the spring of 1921, converted to orthodox Freudian psychoanalysis, there was a split between him and Turner. Glover wanted to make the clinic purely psychoanalytic and for it to join with the recently founded British Psychoanalytic Society. Turner wished to remain loyal to her friend Murray's vision, and perhaps, as Suzanne Wright has suggested, was also reluctant to give up her freedom to join a male-dominated restrictive society. The conflict between the two directors split the board of management of the clinic and the council of the society. Now, Suzanne Wright has described the history of the medical psychological clinic as one of the most significant repressed narratives in the history of psychoanalysis in Britain. I would claim it was not only repressed, but actually actively suppressed by Freud's disciple Ernest Jones, who had his own agenda of building a psychoanalytic empire in Britain and took advantage of the crisis created by Murray's death. Jones saw the clinic as a threat. Both were struggling for acceptance by orthodox medicine and took every opportunity to devalue its work. He always denigrated it by referring to it as the Brunswick Square Clinic, rather than by using its official title, the Medico-Psychological Clinic, which might make it sound more respectable to orthodox medicine. Jones had three major objections to the clinic. The staff, or at least some of them, were lay rather than medically qualified, and thus unlikely to win approval from orthodox medicine. The analyses carried out were unorthodox by Freudian standards, and Murray and Turner were too favorably inclined towards Jungian theory. I think the last was the real crime. It's clear from the Rundbriefe, that's the letters that were circulated amongst the psychoanalytic inner circle, that Jones schemed to take over the clinic and its assets. In November 1920, he wrote, "Not one person there has been analysed by a real analyst. Our members rightly refuse to have anything to do with the place, for it's conducted throughout on quite unprofessional lines. Turns out scores of so-called lay psychoanalysts every year who practice analysis on their own accord, and so discredit psychoanalysis very seriously, especially in the eyes of the medical profession, many of whom identify psychoanalysis and lay quackery. We have the secret hope that someday the clinic will collapse and that we may be able to convert it into a proper place like the Berlin Polyclinic." In February 1921, he elaborated, "Miss Turner is certainly the evil genius of the place, and there is no hope till she goes, which perhaps will not be long." Hans Sachs and Carl Abraham provide the reason for Jones's antagonism toward Turner. They wrote, "The director of the clinic, Miss Turner, seems to exert a harmful influence by larding the psychoanalysis in the manner of Jung." By May, Jones was able to report that there seems good hope of the clinics falling into our hands if we proceed cautiously. Glover has not returned there since he came back from Berlin, but I advised him to do so and thus keep his influence there till it's needed for the coup. In June, he writes, "Miss Turner, our only obstacle at the Brunswick Square Clinic, has offered to resign if a suitable substitute can be found. This brings our hopes perceptibly nearer, for Glover should now have things in his own hands." The following month, he proclaimed triumphantly, the Brunswick Square Clinic is, as you know, closed, and Miss Turner is opening one on her own lines. Although hugely popular, the clinic had run into increasingly serious debt and went into voluntary liquidation in 1923. Turner was saved from financial disaster by her family's firm of solicitors. But as Elaine Shawalter comments, within a few years, the work of Murray and Turner had passed into oblivion. Murray's grave, I think, is symbolic. There's now no gravestone, only a broken cross bearing the words "in loving memory," which may or may not belong to the grave. If you want to go and find it, go to Karl Marx's grave in Highgate Cemetery and keep going until you get to a large horse chestnut tree on the right, and it's just there. Although the cemetery has no record of the fact, it probably also contains the ashes of Julia Turner, the last clause of whose will reads, "It's my desire that my body be cremated and my ashes scattered on the grave of my said dear friend, Jessie Margaret Murray, in Highgate Cemetery," which is incidentally how I discovered where Jessie Murray's grave was. Turner withdrew from the clinic and founded the Psychological Aid Society in September 1921. I haven't been able to find out anything about what the Psychological Aid Society was. She lived at Ensley Street from 1922 onwards, seeing patients and training therapists. Her book, The Dream and the Anxiety Hypothesis, which was published in 1923, bears the dedication to Jessie Margaret Murray, MD, BS, Durham, note the qualification, from whose inspired teaching and example is derived anything of value therein. In 1935, she moved to an apartment in Ensley Court, Upper Woburn Place. And by extraordinary coincidence, I was involved with a group of visiting American students who were doing a course in history of psychology in London, who had actually rented an apartment in the block. So I was able to go and look at Julia Turner's front door. And she died in this house in Oswald Hill in 1946. So to conclude, although the clinic disappeared from view, it bequeaths a larger share of its endowment in experience and training to the Tavistock Clinic and the British Psychoanalytic Society. The Tavistock Square Clinic for Functional Nervous Disorders opened at 51 Tavistock Square, which I think is probably where the Tavistock Hotel now is. sharing not only location, but also a vision with its predecessor. Hugh Crichton Miller, its inspiration and founder, set out to provide psychotherapy for outpatients suffering from psychoneurotic and personality disorders who were not catered for by other public services and who were unable to afford private fees. Like Murray, his approach to treatment was eclectic and holistic, favoring a range of psychotherapeutic methods, but predominantly those that were psychodynamic in orientation. His supporters included a number of staff, Agnes Saville was one of them, who had been associated with the medico-psychological clinic. Like its predecessor, the clinic also offered instruction in mental hygiene to both medical and non-medical personnel. It too was enormously successful, but lastingly so, after a number of vicissitudes, ultimately becoming absorbed in the National Health Service. The British Psychoanalytic Society Clinic opened in 1924. The British Psychoanalytic Society, founded by Ernest Jones in February 1919, included amongst its members at least 13 people who had been either staff at the medico-psychological clinic and or students of the SSO. So finally, some reflections on the implications of Murray's and Turner's personalities and social networks and with regard to the subsequent development of psychoanalysis in Britain. Murray is revealed as a courageous, forceful, energetic, outgoing personality, dynamic in both senses of the word, the leading spirit in the foundation and work of the medico-psychological clinic. In contrast, her animus, Turner, appears as a much more introverted character who withdrew from the clinic rather than confront James Glover and maintained her loyalty to Murray until her own death a quarter of a century later. Whereas Murray, with her medical background, spent her time networking and engaged in action, Turner, with her literary background, remember she had a degree in classics, devoted her time to thinking, reading, and writing. She lacked Murray's leadership qualities and was unable to take her mission forward. Murray's approach was liberal, open-minded, and eclectic. She offered the new psychological therapies alongside the more traditional orthodox approaches to treatment. She employed a variety of different psychotherapeutic methods, combining elements from Jung as well as Freud. She was motivated by egalitarian and philanthropic views. Her goal was to make therapy available to those unable to afford private treatment, and she welcomed both lay and medically qualified trainee therapists. With her death, this vision was largely lost. For the most part, the British psychoanalytic scene became dominated by strict adherence to a rigid, orthodox, masculine-oriented continental model with resulting sectarianism and the pure elixir available only to those with financial means. Thank you, and thanks to all these people who've helped me with the research at various stages. Do I now stop share? You've done it. Oh, now I can see everybody. Hello, Helen.
Well, that was fascinating. Could I ask one question first? Obviously, the impact of the First World War, and people were faced for the first time these incredible effects on people in this swampy trenches and shell shock that occurred by the bombardment. That must have had a huge impact on people's awareness of the need for this.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, they obviously set up this annex or what for shell-shocked soldiers. But I also think that what we're going through now is, in some ways, like the First World War. It's really overturned everything, how one thinks about everything.
Yeah. Did the people who sought treatment there from shell shock have to fund it themselves, or did they get any help from government sources or anything like this?
I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to that. Perhaps somebody else does.
Right. Are there other questions that people would like to ask? If so, unmute yourself first to be able to do so. Right.
I've got a question. Liz?
Yes. Hello, Karen. Yes, I can.
But I thought that was really fascinating, and I I find the fact that they were trying to set up these institutions and to do all this against the background, as Malcolm was saying, of the First World War, when people must have been very distracted by what was going on the Western Front. I mean, it's strange that you barely mention the war except to talk about these shell-shocked soldiers. And yet it must have been so dominant in people's consciousness. It seems strange that they were trying to do this against that background that must have been so distracting.
But on the other hand, perhaps as Malcolm says, there was all the more call for it.
But were the people they treated, do you think, I mean, do we know, were they people who had been shell-shocked or people who had fought in the war, or did people who had lost their children?
I think probably the people who'd fought in the war were only a small proportion of the people I get the impression that otherwise it would be the general population, and particularly those without financial means.
Yes. It just seems strange that the period in which they're setting this up and doing this, I mean, it's almost as if the war wasn't going on, but that may be just the way that you've chosen to present it. I've got another question. It's about, have I got this right, that neither Murray nor Turner had themselves been analysed?
That's correct, yes. I think they just read the literature and thought it was self-taught.
But felt that they were able then to analyse others.
Yes, amazing.
Would that be thought not very proper now?
Yeah, well, it was thought not very proper then.
I see.
by some people.
Yes.
But on the other hand, they trained people who then became the core therapists. They went to the TAVI and joined the British Psychoanalytic Society.
But it's interesting that they didn't feel once they got interested in psychoanalysis that they should go and be analysed themselves.
No, that's true. I mean, maybe they didn't have the financial, the opportunity to do so. But I agree, it does seem surprising that they felt competent to do it.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Ruth?
Yes. Hello.
Hello, Ruth.
Hello, Liz. Excellent talk. I think I've come across this Ernest Jones in connection with the research we did for Streets of St Pancras. I think he lived somewhere around Euston Square, and the general drift of what we could make out about him was that he was very antagonistic towards people who didn't agree with his point of view. So
correct.
I don't think they should feel too aggrieved about it. I think he seemed to rubbish everybody that didn't.
I think it's a nasty piece of work.
It did sound to me. Anyway,
yes. There's actually a very good good biography of him. I forget the author, but I can find it. I'm sure you'll be able to Google it.
Yeah.
The wife of the editor of Nature, I think.
Anyway, I think also that quite by chance that this talk is quite a good preamble, as it were, in a strange sort of way, to the fact that the Bloomsbury Festival starts tomorrow, and there's all sorts of events going on over the next few weeks, about the next week or so, including posters of illustrations of some of the gardens in the area. I've seen some of them today. If people want to have a look at that and look at the Bloomsbury Festival website, I think there's other events, but quite a lot of outdoor events going on if people are interested. I thought I'd let you know.
Yeah.
Right, yes, Fiona. Unmute. Can you unmute? Can you unmute first? You need to unmute.
I am.
You don't now, sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I enjoyed that. It was very interesting. You'll have to turn down your volume. Sorry, Caroline and I are sitting in the same room and we get feedback.
Oh yes, yeah, that's a common problem.
So I really enjoyed that, and I will own up. I'm a Jungian analyst, so I'm particularly interested in the Medio Psychological Society. I wonder, in your research, Did you come across any relationship with the Tavistock Clinic? Because really, Crichton Miller, working at the same time, working on shell shock and so forth, in a very similar way, working with lay people, not wearing white coats and so forth.
Yeah, yes, that's right.
So
That's exactly what I said.
What connection they had early on.
Well, yes, I mean, I don't know about the personal connection, but obviously a lot of people who'd worked at the medical psychological clinic that then joined the Tavistock Clinic. So there's obviously big overlap. Yes, yes, afterwards.
But you didn't sort of pick up any, I mean, potentially they could have been rivals, but in
yes,
way, they wouldn't have been because there was such a need at the time for that.
And trying to do the same thing. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. And I have to say psychoanalysis, they have terrible history. They're always quarreling and falling out. Doctrinal differences.
Yes, that's very striking, isn't it?
And you bring that very clearly with a lay person who nevertheless is working in the spirit, that particular spirit, in a very much wider sense. Yeah, well, thank you very much. I enjoyed
Thank you.
Right, are there any more questions? Well, thank you very much for that talk of not just one, but two pioneers, because you were talking as well about Murray Stopes, who both lived and worked in the borough. So it was a fascinating account of two such important pioneers. And I've learned a lot more, and I wander around Brunswick Square with more interest as well and see what was there. But thank you very much for that talk, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.